what's up? I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Absolute pleasure to be joined today by Alex Gibney, award-winning filmmaker. How are you?
Good to see you.
How's everything going?
All good.
So you've done a bunch of different things in your career, but Russia, Khodorkovsky, Putin, a lot going on here. What was it like jumping into this whole world?
Well, it was crazy, and I can't say I'm any kind of Russia expert. I was jumping in the pool blind.
Had you been to Russia before?
I had been. You know, I'd been a long time ago when it was the Soviet Union. I traveled the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Oh my gosh.
But that was a long time ago. And then a few years ago, while I was shooting a film called Zero Days, I went to, hadn't really done a deep dive, and this was a pure Russia story, so I had to really dig deep. I mean, I did a lot of reading, a lot of preparations, talking to a lot of people. It was fascinating. And then I went there for about 2.5 weeks.
Wow. So what was most fascinating to you in this entire story?
Well, understanding what had happened to Russia. You know, since the Soviet Union, I don't think a lot of us had really paid attention, to be honest with you. And I think after 2016 election, suddenly it was like, whoa.
Now it's suddenly front of mind.
Yeah. How does that place work?
Right.
That was really, those are some of the questions I was asking. And Khodorkovsky's story seemed like a pretty good one to look at in terms of understand. Because I do a lot of films about power and abuses of power. And if you want to understand power, this is a guy who went from the bottom all the way to the top, back to the bottom again, and now a dissident. And he also goes toe-to-toe with Putin. And there's a lot of interest in Putin. So for all those reasons, it seemed like a compelling story to do.
And just the idea that a lot of this was happening on TV. Like even the fact that Putin's rise is all on TV. And
well, he was a kind of TV-created character.
Which made me think of somebody here.
Indeed, indeed. And I think for people who watch this film, there are a lot of uneasy parallels in watching the Putin story versus the, say, Donald Trump story.
Sure.
But one of those is for sure that idea that TV created a Putin that was really a fictional kind of James Bond-like character that was nothing like the real character. Same thing here. You know, The Apprentice created Donald Trump as a hugely successful businessman, even though he may have been the worst businessman in history.
That's the irony, the true irony there. But again, you see something on TV, and it may not be the real thing.
And you may just want to believe it.
Right, yeah, certainly. You mentioned a lot of the oil situation in Russia, and oil just seems to be this huge thing that kind of connects so many different countries in the world. How did oil play a factor in this whole story? Well,
oil is the stuff that turns the machines. Now, you know, we're learning very quickly, or, you know, how damaging it is, but nevertheless, energy is power, literally power, as in electrical power, and the power that runs the cars, and so I think that, you know, Khodorkovsky became a businessman in this Wild West capitalist period of Russia by manipulating this sort of Wild West environment, but he always wanted to have an oil company. And that's what he got, you know, in the mid-90s through a wild scam. I think you'd have to call it a scam called loans for shares. And basically what it was is Khodorkovsky and a bunch of other very wealthy people, the oligarchs in Russia, lent the government money. The government really didn't have enough money to pay pensions and salaries that the government basically knew they couldn't pay back. And the idea was if they defaulted on the loan, they would put up for auction these hugely valuable, massive state companies, one of which was Yukos, which was the company that Mikhail Khodorkovsky ended up running. And his bank organized the auction.
It's funny how that works, right?
Indeed, and it won't come as a surprise for you to learn that he won the auction that he was running, and then got Yukos, the oil company. And soon, you know, after a very brief dive where oil prices dropped and so did the price of the ruble, he came soaring back. And by 2003, when he goes toe-to-toe with Putin, he's the richest man in Russia.
You mentioned going toe-to-toe with Putin, and there have been people that have done that. It hasn't worked well for them. He obviously does that, and he ends up in prison. So why do you think that ultimately happens? And do you think there could have been an alternate timeline where he succeeds in that way?
Well, I think, you know, Putin made it very clear in the time following his ascent. And by the way, he was appointed president by Boris Yeltsin. Then he was re-elected, but he was appointed president in 2000. And when he's re-elected, he makes a pretty definitive statement to the oligarchs, the wealthy businessmen. He said, so long as you guys stick to business and stay out of politics, we're going to be okay. But coming into 2003, Chodorkovsky was not staying out of politics. He was very interested in the representative body, the Duma. You know, there were reports of him buying politicians, and he was also very interested in creating a different kind of political economy in Russia, much more rules-based, you know, greater attention to the rule of law, and that was as he was getting ready to do a massive merger, potentially with ExxonMobil. Then, on television, live primetime television, there is a forum on corruption. And in that forum, just a few seats away from Putin, Chodorkovsky basically accuses Putin of corruption. And very soon afterwards, just a few months afterwards, Chodorkovsky was on his way to a Siberian prison. Now, you know, so the warning signs were there, but when that happened, it was really a warning bell for everybody. It was like, if you're going to put Russia's most powerful man, it'd be like Trump putting Bloomberg in prison on a whim. Then, you know, something's up. And basically that was Putin's way of saying, cross me and you're done.
Wow, that's really interesting. What do you think Chodorkovsky learned about himself while he was in prison?
A lot. I mean, I think, look, Chodorkovsky saw capitalism as a game. And I don't think he gave much, as he was making his fortune, I don't think he paid much attention to the human cost of that game. And for people who don't make it in capitalism, it can be pretty bleak. I mean, this is, you know, while he was thinking about it as a game, most people thought about it as life and death. I think while he was in prison, where he went from one of the most powerful men in Russia to somebody who was powerless. The only power he had was to kill himself, and by which I mean sometimes he engaged in hunger strikes. But he then got to a reckoning not only of what it is to be a human being, but what it is to be a citizen, and how important that the rights of citizens are protected by a rule of law, and by a free press, and by representative government. And I think he had a kind of sea change in terms of how business and how government works, so that when he comes out of prison 10 years later, you know, he is a changed man.
And how power works also. And when
Indeed.
you're powerful, you're thinking about certain things, but when you're not powerful, suddenly you're focusing on a free press, and suddenly you're focusing on the economy.
That's right.
And those are much different things in your world as they were once before.
That's right.
So the whole power thing is really interesting, because you've spent your whole career kind of looking at people who've had power, people who've lost power. Why are we so fascinated with that as a society? What do you think it is?
Well, look, power is important. Power moves things. Power, you know, another way of saying power is electricity. You know, it's the thing that turns the lights on. So power is important. It's like we can't live without power. You need power to move things. But when too few people get a hold of power, they abuse it. It's and so you need to pay careful attention to that. Not only how people abuse power, but how we let them abuse power. And very often we let them do it because they sell us fictions about what they're doing that we're only too happy to invest in. Make Russia great again would be a fiction that Putin sold to the Russian people that has, again, a kind of ominous echo in this country.
Totally. And there's just this believability factor too, because somebody's powerful, they're in this position, and we like to think, okay, they have our best interests in mind. They seem confident in what they're saying, but a lot of it can be BS, whether it's Putin, whether it's Trump. Some people just give off a certain appearance, and people trust that.
Right.
Why do you think that happens?
Well, it's like the Wizard of Oz. I mean, a lot of it is constructing this big and magnificent lie that people invest in, and from time to time we need Toto to pull back the curtain. But I think that part of it too is that the people in power suddenly assume a sense of rectitude, and they don't even think that it's possible to abuse power. And they don't think it's necessary to tell the truth anymore, because why do you need to tell the truth? Some people might consider that abuse of power, but if you're in power, the whole point is to be able to say what you want to say when you want to say it, and do what you want.
Yeah.
And that is another very disquieting thing about how power works in Russia. Now Putin controls the two major television networks. Khodorkovsky can't even be seen on television in Russia. And so he's able to project an image like the great and magnificent Oz that is completely controlled by him.
Yeah.
So that is something we need to pay close attention to.
And just this idea of him being displaced too in London and, you know, potentially never going back to Russia.
Well, I think he feels that he's haunted by that. Khodorkovsky, as a person, bleeds Russia. You know, he's on his mobile device all day long. You know, checking stories coming out of Russia, checking emails in Russian. You know, always thinking about, you know, how he might influence things in Russia. Sadly for him, you know, with his history as an oligarch, I don't think there's any kind of political future for him as a person, as a figure. But in terms, he still has quite a bit of money, and he has a lot of determination, both to continue to root out corruption and to support democratic movements in Russia to try to change things.
I gotcha. So you've been in the documentary game for a really long time. When I look at streaming right now, like, the popularity of documentaries seems like it's an all-time high, and for you, that's a great thing.
It is.
When did you sense that things were becoming more popular with documentaries?
Well, yeah, I can tell you it wasn't always that way.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
When I was scuffling, people would advise me, if you're going in to look for a job, don't say the word documentary.
How long ago was that?
Well, maybe 20 years ago. But I think in the last 10, 15 years, documentarians have kind of upped their game. And also, I think reality television, weirdly, I think convinced everybody that you could that there was an audience for programming without actors. And then a kind of sea change happened, I think, partially with the coming of the streamers, but partially it was happening before that, which was once you got out of the sponsorship game, you could say things, you know, and people were buying content, you know, just for buying content. They weren't subjects or viewers being rented by advertisers. They were literally buying the content that they wanted to watch. Well, if you could present a compelling story about a really important event, person, or issue, well, people are going to watch. And suddenly the reins were lifted, and instead of this kind of horrible world, which I was part of 25 years ago, where, you know, every channel had a style, and
that's just so frustrating.
It's so frustrating and horrible, and it was all designed to please the sponsor, right? Well, now it's all about pleasing the viewer with a compelling story, and documentarians are bringing it now. They're making films, real life films that are every bit as engaging, if not more so, than, you know, the biggest budgeted Hollywood spectacle.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting because here's a perfect example of a story. Like, Russia is obviously a part of our narrative. We don't know this specific story here in America. You can go to Silicon Valley and tell a story about a woman who's inventing something that we may not have heard of either. So it must be just such a fun world for you to play in because the story is finally the focal point, whereas before you had to satisfy different interests.
That's right. And you can dig in, and honestly, it's not unlike scripted movies.
Yeah.
It's you just write the script at the end instead of the beginning.
Exactly.
And it's more fun in a way because you're always reckoning with a world that's constantly changing and trying to make sense out of that chaos, which I think is well, I don't think I know. It's fun.
Yeah, totally. What have been the most important things in forming your style? Because, like, you're the documentary guy. I mean, it's politics, it's sports, it's all these different angles. What have been the most important things in creating your style along the way?
I mean, along the way, you know, you find films that just rock your world, and they end up helping you to understand how to find your own personal voice, even as you try to reckon with issues or subjects that move you. I've always been, for whatever reason, maybe because I've always sucked down and kicked up instead of the opposite.
Interesting.
I've been interested in stories about abuses of power, but I've looked at, I guess my career changed oddly. I was a producer for a series that was executive produced by Martin Scorsese called The Blues.
Right.
And the idea was 8 directors, Scorsese was one, Clint Eastwood was one, Antoine Fuqua was one, Wim Wenders. You know, we're all going to do riffs on the blues, right? And they had great respect for the music, great respect for real life, but they all had a kind of personal vision and style. And it was a very rigorous personal vision and style. I thought, wow, if I could take that idea and turn it on stories that really engage me, like Enron or Taxi to the Dark Side, you know, that would be something. And
So what were the films that rocked you? You mentioned that.
you know, going way back, there was a film called Gimme Shelter by the Maysles brothers, and that's, you know, it starts out as kind of a follow doc of the Rolling Stones. It ends up being a murder mystery. Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, hugely influential to me. He kind of reinvented how documentaries are made, because he conceived of the idea of the recreation. I mean, he didn't conceive of it. You know, Robert Flaherty was mocking things, you know, back with Nanook of the North, but this time it was really a vision of how to render memory and imagination in a film that's a documentary. There was an animated documentary called Waltz with Bashir that was hugely influential for me, where the whole, it's a documentary, but it's animated. It's real people recalling kind of nightmarish visions of something that they'd done. And then at the very end of the film, that animation gives way to a moment of horrific real life. And you realize that the nightmare has now become real. So films like that, Stories We Tell by the wonderful Canadian actress whose name I can't remember. Oh my God!
But you got a lot
Sarah
of good
Polley.
ones. Okay.
And you know, they're good ones, and I'm always on the lookout for others.
Yeah, I'm sure. Even like the fact that you mentioned Enron, like all these years later, we're still talking about that story. And I'm sure you've done documentaries that you thought would be huge and haven't necessarily had the same shelf life. So
that's true.
What's it like unpacking that whole world where you're like, I don't know if this is going to hit necessarily, but I'm really interested in telling this story.
At the end of the day, what becomes important then is not, is it going to hit, though it's hugely gratifying when it does, and when it becomes part of the zeitgeist. Enron was like that. Going Clear, my film about Scientology, was like that. Weirdly, The Inventor,
why do you think it hit so well?
I don't know, but I think people were fascinated by a scamster in Silicon Valley, but this time it's a woman.
Right.
And also how many people were fooled by her. So I think they enjoyed the idea that she fooled all those people. At the same time, they were horrified by it. But what was your question?
Just how certain things hit and certain things don't.
Oh yeah, so, but the more important thing is, when you're focusing on a story, you do your best to tell that story, and some have a smaller audience. Taxi to the Dark Side, which won the Oscar, actually had a pretty small audience, but it had a really big impact on the military. The Army JAG School, you know, had it as required viewing. West Point was teaching it. So films can have impact in ways that you don't predict, and you just do your best to tell an important story in as truthful a way as possible, and let the chips fall where they may.
What's a world you're interested in taking a look at you haven't done yet?
I'm interested in looking at I'm interested in looking at a big crime. It may be, I'm going to call it the crime of the century. I'm going to leave it open as to what that is, but that's what I'm working on right now.
Good deal. If you're telling that story, I'm in for it. Alex,
Good.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
When's the big day that this is out in theaters in LA?
This Friday.
This Friday.
22nd.
All right, good deal. That's Alex. I'm DJ. See you next time. All right, let's sit down.